She was born in a village where beauty was both a blessing and a curse, where every smile she carried and every step she took seemed to radiate a quiet grace that few could ignore. Her face held the softness of morning light, and her eyes carried the stillness of deep water. Yet it was not only her appearance that drew attention but the quiet resilience with which she lived. She worked harder than most, tending to the fields, fetching water, and caring for those around her with a devotion that came as naturally as breathing. Many admired her, whispering that she was favored by the ancestors, that the spirits had touched her with a gentle hand. But admiration often carries the seeds of envy, and within her own household those seeds took root and grew thorns. Her stepmother, a woman hardened by bitterness, watched her with eyes that sharpened each time others praised the girl. To the stepmother, every kind word offered to the young woman was an insult carved against her own children, who seemed to vanish into the background whenever the girl was near. The stepmother's sons and daughters echoed their mother's spite, mocking the girl, pushing her toward the most difficult tasks, and blaming her for misfortunes that were not hers to carry. If a pot cracked while cooking, they said it was her fault. If rain delayed the harvest, they insisted she had cursed the fields. Slowly, the whispers spread, and villagers who once admired her began to shift their gazes, torn between respect and suspicion, unwilling to stand against the family's venom. Her father, once a shield against the world's cruelty, grew silent. Perhaps he was weary, perhaps he was afraid, or perhaps he too had been poisoned by the ceaseless drip of resentment whispered into his ears at night. He no longer spoke in her defense, and in the spaces where his voice once lived, only silence grew. The girl, though hurt, did not complain. She bore each day with quiet endurance, carrying the weight of loneliness with a dignity that only made her shine brighter. But her stepmother could not bear the contrast. For every cruel word, the girl responded with patience. For every act of spite, she offered kindness. And in that patience, in that kindness, the stepmother saw a mirror that revealed her own ugliness too clearly. Hatred sharpened into something darker. The villagers began to sense it. They noticed the stepmother's glare when the girl entered the marketplace, the way her children whispered cruel jokes, and the way the father averted his eyes. Still, no one intervened. They told themselves it was not their place, that families had their own troubles to manage. Yet beneath their silence ran an undercurrent of fear. Fear of the stepmother's sharp tongue, fear of her connections, fear of standing against cruelty and finding themselves its next target. The girl walked through these shifting glances, shoulders straight, though inside her spirit bent beneath the burden of betrayal. The breaking point came when a visiting elder praised her beauty and her strength in front of the entire village. He declared that such a young woman could bring honor and wealth to her family, that her name could one day be sung like the heroines of old. To her stepmother, those words were daggers. In her heart, jealousy twisted into something unthinkable. The thought of her stepdaughter rising above her own children, of her name being remembered while theirs faded, was unbearable. That night, as the moon hid behind thick clouds, the stepmother gathered her children and whispered a plan that dripped with cruelty. They would not let her brightness shame them. They would not allow her gentleness to eclipse their names. The girl sensed the shift, though no one spoke it aloud. She felt the air grow colder around her, felt the silences stretch longer, and noticed the way her siblings' laughter carried an edge sharper than before. But she still hoped, still believed that kindness might turn their hearts. She did not yet understand that envy, once planted, does not wither with kindness, it grows hungrier. She did not know that betrayal was already unfolding in secret, a shadow sharpening just beyond her sight. The villagers too felt the storm gathering, though none dared name it. They saw the stepmother's calculating eyes, the father's weary silence, the children's mocking smirks. But they looked away. They busied themselves with their own chores, told themselves that misfortune belonged only to the household where it brewed. And so the young woman, though admired by spirits and cursed by kin, stood on the edge of a fate she could not yet imagine. Innocent, graceful, resilient, and utterly alone in a world that was about to turn on her with a cruelty sharper than any blade. The day began with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over a village before something unspeakable is about to happen. The young woman woke as she always did, her spirit weary yet hopeful that perhaps kindness would soften the hearts around her. But as she stepped outside, she found faces waiting, faces that carried no warmth, no trace of family or neighborly regard. Her stepmother stood at the center, her eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that chilled the girl's blood. The villagers had been summoned, though most did not know the reason, and whispers rippled through the gathering like dry leaves in a restless wind. The stepmother's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. She accused the girl of sorcery, of bringing misfortune upon the harvest, of luring the attention of men with her beauty in a way that dishonored the family. Every word was venomous, yet carefully spun to sound like justice. The father remained silent, his face carved of stone, though his eyes betrayed the flicker of doubt. But silence is as heavy as guilt, and in that silence the accusations rooted themselves deep. The villagers, uncertain and fearful, did not step forward. They watched, uneasy, yet unwilling to break the tide that had begun to rise. The girl's protests were soft at first, gentle attempts to reason with the crowd, to plead for truth to be seen. But her words fell like stones into a void. No echo returned, no hand reached to stop what had already been decided in secret. Her stepmother raised her voice again, calling for punishment, for sacrifice. If her beauty has cursed us, then let it be cut away. If her hands bring ruin, let them be removed. It was madness dressed as reason, but in a village ruled by fear and whispers, madness often found fertile ground. Two men stepped forward, men who had once shared laughter with her during the harvest, men who had eaten the meal she had prepared. They could not meet her eyes as they bound her arms, dragging her toward the central clearing where judgment was carried out. She stumbled, her heart pounding, her breath breaking into ragged sobs as the crowd closed in around her. The villagers' faces blurred into a wall of indifference, some cold, some reluctant, some merely curious to see how cruelty dressed itself as justice. The blade was brought out, its edge catching the sunlight with a cruel gleam. The girl's eyes widened, terror seizing her chest as she realized the depth of her stepmother's malice. She cried out, calling to her father, calling to the ancestors, calling to anyone who would listen. But her father looked away, his jaw clenched, his body unmoving. The stepmother's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, and the crowd shifted uneasily, torn between pity and fear of defying the order. When the blade touched her skin, time seemed to shatter. Her scream ripped through the air, raw and piercing, echoing against the huts and hills. The sound was not just pain but betrayal given voice, the tearing of trust, the ripping of bonds, the shattering of innocence. Her body convulsed as blood poured freely, soaking the earth beneath her, marking the ground with crimson that would not soon fade. The villagers flinched but did not intervene. Children covered their ears, mothers turned their faces, yet none moved to stop the cruelty unfolding before them. Her second hand followed, severed with the same cold indifference. She collapsed, her body trembling, her voice breaking into sobs that twisted into silence. The world around her blurred, her vision dimming as the weight of agony dragged her into darkness. But through the haze of pain, she heard the stepmother's voice, triumphant and venomous, declaring that the curse had been lifted, that justice had been served. The villagers nodded, some reluctantly, others eagerly, as though agreement could erase the truth of what they had witnessed. The girl lay crumpled, her life spilling out onto the soil, her body broken yet her spirit clinging stubbornly to breath. No one came to her aid. No hand reached to bandage her wounds, no voice rose to defend her humanity. The cruelty was complete not only in the act itself but in the silence that followed, the silence that declared her suffering acceptable. She was not a daughter, not a neighbor, not a sister. She was a scapegoat, a vessel for the hatred and fear others refused to face within themselves. As the villagers dispersed, muttering prayers and superstitions, she remained behind, her body trembling, her heart beating weakly against the weight of betrayal. The earth beneath her drank her blood, but the sky above remained clear, indifferent, as though the ancestors themselves had turned their gaze away. Yet somewhere deep within her, beyond the agony and despair, a spark endured. They had cut her hands, but they had not severed her essence. They had silenced her voice, but they had not stilled the truth that lived within her shadow. They left her at the edge of the village, her arms bandaged crudely with strips of cloth, the blood still seeping through, her body shaking with fever and exhaustion. There was no farewell, no blessing, not even a glance of pity as she stumbled forward. The villagers had washed their hands of her, declaring that her suffering had cleansed them of whatever curse they had imagined. Her stepmother watched her go with a satisfied smirk, while her father turned his face away as though she had never existed. The young woman's legs wobbled under her, but she walked on because there was nowhere else to go, and standing still would only mean death at their hands or the beasts that lurked in the night. The forest swallowed her quickly. Its towering trees blocked out much of the sunlight, their branches tangled like the ribs of some great beast. The ground was uneven, roots twisting beneath her feet, stones cutting into her skin as she stumbled barefoot. She had no hands to push branches aside, no fingers to grip and steady herself, only her raw will to keep moving. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, thirst burned in her throat, and pain throbbed through her bandaged stumps with every step. Despair pressed heavily on her, whispering that she would die alone in this endless darkness. The first night was the hardest. She collapsed beside a fallen tree, curling her body tightly against the cold. The forest came alive with sounds, owls calling from above, insects buzzing, the distant howl of a jackal. She trembled, unable to shield herself, unable even to wipe the tears that streamed down her face. She cried until her throat was raw, until her sobs turned into whispers of prayer, begging the ancestors to take her swiftly. But morning came anyway, indifferent to her pain, and with it came another day she was forced to endure. She learned to survive in small, desperate ways. She leaned down to drink from streams, though the water often spilled clumsily across her face. She knelt to tear at roots with her teeth, gnawing at them until her jaw ached. Fruits became her lifeline. She learned to shake low branches with her body until they dropped their offerings, bruised but edible. Each task was humiliating, each attempt a reminder of what had been taken from her, but still she persisted. She refused to let the cruelty of others decide the end of her story. There were moments when despair nearly consumed her. Once, when she slipped on wet stones and plunged into a stream, she thought of letting the current carry her away, of surrendering to the water's cold embrace. Another time, when she awoke to find her wounds bleeding again, she imagined simply lying still until her body gave out. But each time, something deep within her stirred, an ember of stubbornness, a refusal to let those who had wronged her have the final word. She would not let her stepmother's laughter be the last sound echoing over her memory. As days turned into weeks, the forest began to change around her. What had once felt hostile grew strangely familiar. Birds no longer startled at her presence. Deer sometimes lingered in the distance, watching her with curious eyes rather than fleeing. The rustling of leaves became less menacing and more like whispers guiding her path. Though she still bore the marks of pain, though her arms still ached with phantom agony, she began to feel less like prey and more like a wanderer with unseen company. At night, when the moonlight filtered through the branches, she noticed something strange. Her shadow, cast long and thin against the forest floor, did not always move as she did. Sometimes it lingered a heartbeat longer when she turned her head, or bent forward as though studying her even when she stood still. At first she thought it a trick of the light, the exhaustion of hunger clouding her eyes. But as the nights passed, she realized it was no mistake. Her shadow was not simply following, it was waiting. And though she did not yet understand what it meant, a small part of her took comfort in it. She was broken, abandoned, cast into darkness. Yet somehow she was not entirely alone. At first, she thought it was her mind playing cruel tricks on her, the exhaustion of hunger and pain bending her senses. But the longer she stayed in the forest, the harder it became to ignore what was happening. Whenever she walked under the pale light of the moon, her shadow stretched across the earth like a companion. Yet it no longer mirrored her perfectly. If she turned her head, it hesitated a moment longer before following. If she stumbled, it seemed to hold itself steady, as though it carried strength that she herself lacked. Small, almost imperceptible differences, but enough to chill her to the bone when she noticed them. The first true sign came one evening as she knelt beside a stream. She bent awkwardly, lowering her face to drink, the cold water spilling clumsily across her lips. As she lifted her head, she saw it clearly. Her reflection in the water showed her armless body, broken and scarred, but her shadow cast on the surface of the rippling stream raised hands that were no longer hers. Fingers, long, dark, unmistakable, cupped the water gently, offering it to her reflection as if to quench her thirst. She gasped and staggered back, heart pounding, certain that madness had claimed her. Yet when she looked again, the shadow had returned to stillness, lying quietly at her feet. The signs grew stronger as days passed. When branches hung low across her path, she noticed her shadow brushing them aside even though her body could not. When fruit fell to the ground, she saw the outline of her shadow stooping to pick them up before she managed to push them with her feet. Once, when she tripped on a root and fell, her shadow's arms seemed to extend toward her, soft and protective, though no touch ever reached her skin. Fear and awe mingled within her. Was this a blessing from the ancestors or a curse sent to torment her further? At night, the whispers began. They were not voices exactly, but faint murmurs carried through the rustling leaves, the shifting grass, the gentle sigh of the wind. Sometimes they seemed to rise from the ground itself, as though her shadow were speaking in a language too ancient for her ears to fully comprehend. She would lie awake, listening, straining to make sense of the sounds. And though she could not understand the words, she began to sense their meaning. They spoke of endurance, of strength hidden beneath despair, of justice waiting in silence. One night, under a full moon, she rose from her bed of leaves and dared to test the truth of what she was experiencing. She stepped into a clearing where the moonlight was bright and clear, and she moved deliberately, raising her head, turning her body slowly. Her shadow followed, but with subtle defiance. She lifted the stump of her arm, and the shadow raised a full hand, fingers curling and flexing as if savoring their freedom. She trembled, torn between terror and relief, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time since her mutilation, she saw herself not broken but whole, if only in the realm of darkness. The more she accepted it, the bolder her shadow became. When she shivered in the cold, it wrapped around her like a cloak. When hunger gnawed at her belly, it gestured toward hidden fruit and roots as though guiding her to sustenance. When nightmares woke her in the night, she saw it standing tall and unyielding, as if keeping watch over her fragile sleep. She began to speak to it, whispering her pain, her longing, her fury at those who had betrayed her. And though it never spoke back with words, she felt its presence respond, pulsing with quiet strength. Her fear began to turn into reverence. Perhaps the ancestors had not abandoned her after all. Perhaps they had taken her hands only to return them in another form, untouchable, unstoppable, beyond the reach of blades. The villagers had thought they could silence her, reduce her to nothing. Yet here she was, carrying within her the proof that nothing could truly be destroyed. What they had cut from her flesh had been reborn in the darkness, stronger than before. But there were moments when she wondered if this gift carried danger as well. Once, in a fit of rage as she recalled her stepmother's smile during the punishment, she saw her shadow extend its hand toward a tree. The outline of a blade shimmered in its grip, and with a swift motion, the bark split as if cut by something unseen. She stumbled back, terrified of her own reflection, heart racing at the knowledge that this power could harm as easily as it could protect. The whispers grew louder that night, urging her to remember, to hold on, to endure. She did not yet understand, but a truth was beginning to crystallize. Her shadow was not only her salvation. It was her weapon, and it was waiting. The nights that followed her exile were heavy with silence, but the silence was never truly empty. As she lay beneath the canopy of trees, the stars peering through like watchful eyes, the young woman slipped into restless dreams. At first, they were fractured visions of the past, the sharp gleam of the blade, the jeers of those who had betrayed her, the scream that had torn from her throat and echoed into nothing. But soon her dreams shifted. They no longer replayed her pain, they carried voices. Deep, resonant voices that seemed older than the trees, older than the rivers, voices that made the air in her chest vibrate with meaning. They called her by name, though she could not recall ever hearing their tones before. They were the voices of her ancestors. In one dream, she stood in a vast plain that stretched endlessly in every direction. The ground beneath her was dark and fertile, the kind of soil from which life sprang eternal. A wind swept across the plain, carrying whispers. She saw shapes emerge from the mist, figures draped in flowing garments, their faces lined with age and wisdom. They did not walk as mortals did, they glided, their feet barely touching the ground. Her heart trembled, yet she felt no fear. Instead, a strange warmth enveloped her, as if she had stepped into the embrace of kin long gone. One of the spirits, tall and commanding, stepped forward. His voice rumbled like thunder rolling over distant mountains. "Child," he said, "they thought they could unmake you. They thought the blade could strip you of your strength. But flesh is only flesh. The true essence of a being cannot be severed." Another spirit, a woman with eyes that glowed like firelight, spoke next. "Your shadow remains because it is your essence. It is tied to the sun, to the earth, to the rhythm of existence itself. They could not destroy it because it is not bound by flesh and bone. Your shadow is you, unbroken, eternal. Where your hands faltered, your shadow shall move. Where you wept, your shadow shall rise." She wept in the dream, tears streaming down her cheeks as she lifted her maimed arms. "But I am nothing," she cried. "I cannot feed myself. I cannot fight. I cannot build. What use is a life when it is lived like this?" The spirits' voices rose together, layered like many drums beating in harmony. "Do not mistake weakness for the end of power. Your suffering has opened the path. Through your shadow you will carry what they feared most. They thought to make you helpless, but in doing so they have awakened what cannot be chained. You are not without hands. You are the hands of your ancestors, and the knife they feared has always been yours." Her shadow stretched before her in that dream. At first it was only a dark outline, thin and fragile, trembling like smoke. But as she stared, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow raised arms that she no longer had. Fingers curled into fists. The shape was hers, yet freer, unbound by the pain that consumed her waking hours. Then, glinting in its hand, appeared a knife, long, curved, gleaming as though forged from moonlight itself. The sight sent chills through her, yet she could not look away. The spirits circled her, their voices merging into a single echo. The knife is not steel. It is truth. It is vengeance. It is justice. They cannot cut what belongs to the realm beyond flesh. When the time comes, your shadow will rise, and through it, the wrongs done to you will be undone. She awoke with her heart racing, the sound of the spirit's words still trembling in her ears. The forest was quiet, the air cool and damp with dawn, but when she glanced down, her breath caught. Her shadow lay across the ground, stretched by the morning light. And there, it was no illusion, its hands twitched. Not her broken stumps, but the hands of the shadow. Fingers flexed slowly as though awakening from slumber. For a moment, it reached outward, curling as if gripping something unseen. Her throat tightened, torn between awe and fear. She remembered the words, "Your shadow is the part of you they cannot destroy." That night, the dreams returned again, but this time she did not cry. She listened. She learned. Each time, the ancestors reminded her of who she was. Not just a broken girl cast aside, but a vessel of a greater power. They had tried to erase her, but in doing so, they had bound her closer to the eternal. Her despair began to shift. It did not vanish, grief still lingered, pain still burned, but beneath it, a new foundation formed. A knowledge that she was not alone. The ancestors were with her. Her shadow was with her. And though she had been made to believe she was powerless, she now understood. The truest form of her strength was only beginning to awaken. The night was thick with silence, the kind of silence that presses on the skin until even breathing feels like an intrusion. She sat beneath the trees, her maimed arms wrapped against her body, her head bowed as the moon traced its pale light across the forest floor. The wounds where her hands had been were beginning to scar, but the ache in her chest was deeper than any cut. She had been betrayed, mutilated, cast aside, stripped of what made her human in the eyes of others. Yet tonight, something within her stirred. Something she could not name but felt in the marrow of her bones. The shadow stretched long, stretching further than the natural light should have allowed. Her own shadow quivered on the ground beside her, though she sat utterly still. She froze, her breath caught, her eyes darting to the earth where the outline of her broken body was drawn in darkness. Slowly, impossibly, her shadow's arms lifted, not stumps like hers but full, whole arms with hands intact. Fingers flexed in smooth motion, curling and uncurling as though testing their strength. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Then, in the deepest part of the shadow, something began to gleam. At first, it was only a thin streak of silver, as though the moon had dropped a thread of its light into the darkness. But the streak grew, lengthened, and curved until it took the unmistakable form of a blade. A knife. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in her ears. She knew the shape. The gleam, the curve, the cruel edge, it was the very knife they had used to cut off her hands. The instrument of her torment. The thing that had turned her life into ruin. Yet here it was, reborn not in flesh but in shadow. Unreal yet undeniable. Its surface glimmered even though no light touched it. She stared, transfixed and horrified, as her shadow raised the knife higher, the blade catching the moonlight like a mirror of vengeance. For a moment, she could almost hear it singing. No sound, only a vibration in the air, as if the world itself recognized the power of what had been birthed in darkness. Her stomach knotted with terror. She wanted to look away, to bury her face and deny what she saw, but her eyes were locked. The knife's glow burned into her vision, searing its shape into her soul. It was beautiful in a grotesque way, gleaming with a promise of justice so sharp it felt dangerous even to witness. This was not merely a reflection, it was a weapon of memory, an echo of all the pain she had endured, condensed into a form that her enemies had once believed would end her. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The animals, usually restless at night, had gone silent. Even the wind stilled, as though the world feared to stir while the knife gleamed in her shadow's grip. Her chest heaved, every instinct warring within her. Fear told her to flee, but where could she run? Awe told her to kneel, but to what? To herself? To the ancestors? To the power that had chosen to manifest through her suffering? The shadow moved again. Its head turned slightly, its faceless outline tilting as though studying her. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, the knife descended, not to strike her, but to rest its blade in the earth. The ground shivered faintly where the shadow touched it, as though acknowledging the weight of a thing that was not material, yet heavier than any stone. She gasped, realizing that though the blade was unreal, it left a mark. The soil beneath her shadow's knife darkened, scorched as if touched by fire. She remembered the voices of her ancestors in her dreams, their thunderous reminder, they cannot destroy your essence. Where they cut, your shadow will hold. And now she understood. This was not a gift born of mercy, it was born of balance, of justice that demanded to be carried out. Her mutilation had carved open a space where something greater could emerge. They had thought they ended her, but they had only awakened what slept in her bloodline. The longer she stared, the more the knife seemed to pulse with life. Its edge flickered between existence and nothingness, as though it hovered between worlds. At times it seemed solid, able to cut flesh and bone. At others it was smoke, intangible yet more threatening for its formlessness. She realized then that the knife was not meant only for the body. It was meant for the spirit, for the heart, for the fear that resided in the soul of those who had wronged her. This blade could pierce deeper than any steel. Her fear began to shift. It did not leave her completely, how could it? But it softened, reshaped itself into something closer to reverence. She whispered into the night, her voice trembling. "Is this mine?" The shadow did not answer in words, but its silence carried certainty. The knife gleamed brighter and her own breath steadied. She understood. This was hers, but it was also more than hers. It was the embodiment of every betrayal, every cruelty suffered by the innocent, every silenced scream that had gone unanswered. She was its vessel, but its purpose was larger. For the first time since her exile, her despair did not feel endless. She was still broken, still grieving, still alone, but now she held something greater than herself. Or perhaps, her shadow held it for her because she had no hands to carry it. The irony was cruel and perfect at once. They had taken her flesh, but they had armed her soul. She leaned back against the tree, tears streaking down her face as she watched the knife shimmer. The night pressed close, heavy with the promise of what was to come. She knew then that her suffering had not been the end of her story. It had only been the beginning. She returned at dawn. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and red, as though the heavens themselves carried the memory of her blood. Her figure was thin, almost skeletal from weeks of wandering and starving in the wilderness. Her clothes hung in tatters, her hair tangled with twigs and dirt, and her arms, still ending in those scarred handless stumps, were bandaged with strips of old bark and cloth she had managed to bind around them. To the eye, she was fragile, a broken woman barely clinging to life. But there was something in her that no villager could mistake. It was in the way she walked, not staggering but steady as though each step was deliberate. At first only the children saw her. They had run to the edge of the village to play when one spotted her silhouette emerging from the treeline. He thought it was a spirit, a ghost who had come to take them away, and he screamed. The others followed, their shrill voices carrying through the village. The adults rushed out, prepared to scold the children for their noise, but then they froze. She was there. The girl who had been cast out, the one whose punishment was meant to erase her existence, stood in the morning light. Gasps broke the silence. Some covered their mouths in horror. Others spat at the ground, muttering that she should have stayed dead in the forest. A few crossed their arms in defiance, unwilling to show fear. But what unsettled them most was not her ragged form or her scarred arms. It was her shadow. The sun fell behind her as she entered the clearing, and her shadow stretched across the dusty ground like a black tide. But it did not move naturally. While she walked slowly, almost painfully, her shadow strode with confidence, arms swinging freely, hands intact, fingers curling into fists. When she paused, it did not. It moved ahead of her, scanning the ground, tilting its head toward the villagers with a faceless menace. One woman shrieked and fled, convinced she had seen the shadow's mouth open in a grin though no features were visible. The whispers spread quickly. She should not have come back. Her spirit is tainted. The ancestors curse her presence. Look at the way her shadow moves. Fear clung to every word. Even the elders, who prided themselves on wisdom, could not steady their trembling hands as they watched her pass. Her father emerged from his hut, his face ashen. He had aged in her absence, though the guilt of what he had allowed weighed heavier than the years. When his eyes met hers, he faltered, taking a step back. Once she might have lowered her gaze in shame, but now she did not look away. Her stare was sharp, unblinking. Behind her, her shadow raised an arm as though pointing directly at him. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground. The crowd murmured, half convinced she had cursed him with a look. The stepmother appeared next, clutching her chest, her mouth moving in silent prayers. She had believed the girl would never return, that the forest would have swallowed her whole. But now the impossible stood before her, and terror glittered in her eyes. The shadow seemed to sense her fear. While the girl herself stood still, her shadow glided across the earth, stopping just at the woman's feet. Its arm lifted slowly, fingers wrapping around an unseen object. Then, clear as moonlight, the villagers saw the outline of the knife glint in the shadow's hand. The stepmother screamed and stumbled back, tripping over her skirt as though the blade had already cut her. Yet the girl said nothing. Not one word passed her lips. She did not curse them or threaten them. She simply stood, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with effort, while her shadow conveyed what her voice and her missing hands could not. Children cried, women clutched their babies tighter, men muttered of sending her away again. But no one dared step forward. Something about her presence rooted them to the spot. She was broken in body, yes, but the spirit that walked beside her was whole, and it terrified them. As the sun climbed higher, her shadow shrank, but it did not behave as it should. Even when small, it moved with its own intent, curling and twisting unnaturally as though testing its limits. A dog barked at it, hackles raised, but the moment the shadow shifted toward it, the animal whimpered and fled with its tail tucked. By midday the village had retreated indoors. Doors were shut, windows barred, whispers filling the huts like smoke. Only the elders remained in the open, gathered beneath the baobab tree. They spoke in hushed tones, weighing their fear against their duty. To banish her again might bring greater wrath. To welcome her might invite disaster. She stood before them, waiting, silent. Her shadow crouched behind her, knife glinting faintly as if listening. The eldest among them finally spoke. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "You have returned." The girl nodded once, slowly. The elder hesitated, glancing at her shadow. "What do you seek from us?" She did not answer. But the shadow moved then, tilting its head, raising the knife higher until the blade caught the sun. The elders flinched, and one muttered a prayer to the ancestors. Her silence was louder than words. It told them that she was not the same child they had cast out. She had come back not as their victim, but as their reckoning. By nightfall, the story of her return had already spread beyond the village, carried by frightened tongues. Some said she was no longer human. Others swore she was the chosen of the ancestors. But all agreed on one thing: the girl without hands had come back, and her shadow carried a knife no one dared to face. The night came heavy, darker than any the villagers could remember. Clouds smothered the moon, and the stars hid their light as though even the heavens refused to witness what was about to unfold. Inside their huts, people whispered in trembling voices, trying to convince themselves that the girl was only flesh and blood, that her return carried no danger beyond the shame of their cruelty. But deep in their hearts they knew. They had seen her shadow bend against the sun. They had seen the knife that had no weight and yet struck terror deeper than iron. And they had seen the way guilt itself seemed to cling to those who had wronged her most. She stood in the center of the village square, silent as always, her body frail and trembling from exhaustion. But her shadow, it moved with purpose. The knife gleamed faintly even though no light touched it. Its edge seemed alive as though it hungered. One by one, the villagers began to gather despite themselves, pulled by fear as though bound by invisible threads. The guilty avoided her eyes, but her shadow did not let them hide. The first to be singled out was her father. He stood shaking, his head lowered, his lips muttering frantic prayers. Her shadow stretched toward him, the blade raised high. The knife hovered at his throat, not touching, but close enough that he felt the air grow cold. He collapsed to his knees, his forehead pressed to the earth. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was weak. I did not protect you. I let them cut you. I let them cast you out." But forgiveness did not come. Her shadow pressed the blade downward, and though no steel touched his skin, he screamed. His cries tore through the night as if invisible wounds opened across his soul, cutting deeper than any physical blade. When it finally withdrew, he slumped forward, gasping for air, his body unmarked but his spirit scarred. The stepmother was next. She had tried to hide, locking herself inside her hut, but the shadow crept across the ground, slipping beneath the door. She shrieked as it filled the walls, a darkness thicker than night, the knife flashing in its grasp. The villagers outside heard her screams, each one sharper, more desperate than the last. They did not see what happened inside, but when the door finally burst open, she staggered out, her eyes wide and glassy, her voice lost. She clawed at her own throat as though the shadow's knife still lingered there, cutting without mercy. She fell to the ground, trembling violently, unable to speak again. The elders, who had silenced her when she asked questions, tried to stand together. They raised their staffs and spoke in unison, calling upon the ancestors for protection. But the shadow's knife glowed brighter, casting their figures in sharp relief. One elder stumbled back, clutching his chest as if stabbed. Another staff split cleanly down the middle, though no hand had struck it. Their chants dissolved into cries, their pride crumbling into terror. "This is no child," one wailed, "this is the reckoning of the wronged." The villagers watched, frozen, as the shadow moved with chilling precision. It did not rage. It did not flail wildly. Each motion of the knife was deliberate, measured, and merciless. Where there had been denial, the blade cut truth. Where there had been cruelty, it carved justice. Those who had mocked her, laughed at her screams, or turned their backs when she was exiled found themselves gripped by invisible agony. Some collapsed to the ground, writhing as though the knife carved into their very being. Others fell silent, their eyes clouding over with the weight of their guilt until they could not rise again. And through it all the girl remained still. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, her gaze unfocused as though she herself were only half present. It was not her body that dealt justice, but the essence that had survived when her hands were cut away. The shadow was her truth, the part they could not kill, the part that had returned to claim what was owed. By midnight the square was littered with the broken. Some lived, sobbing into the dirt. Others lay lifeless, their faces twisted in terror. The guilty had been marked, and no one doubted who had judged them. The innocent, those who had stayed silent but had not taken part in her torment, remained untouched, though their fear was no less sharp. They understood now that silence had its price too, and though the blade had spared them tonight, the memory of what they had witnessed would never leave. When the last scream faded into the night, silence returned to the village. Only the whisper of the wind moved, carrying with it the scent of fear. The girl turned slowly, her head bowing as if weary. Behind her, the shadow lowered its knife, fading back into stillness, though its presence lingered like smoke in the lungs of everyone who had seen it. No one dared approach her. No one dared speak. She walked back into the darkness, her frail body vanishing into the night, but her shadow seemed to stretch across the entire village, reminding them all that she would never truly leave. That night was remembered as the night of reckoning. And from that day forward, every villager carried the image of the knife gleaming in the dark, a knife that punished without touching, a knife that no hand could wield, but every guilty heart could feel. The village did not wake the same after the night of reckoning. Dawn came, the sun spilling its golden light across the huts, but it carried no warmth. The villagers stepped out hesitantly, their eyes darting to the ground, fearful of what their own shadows might reveal. Where once the morning had brought chatter, the sound of pestles pounding grain and children's laughter, now there was only silence broken by the nervous shuffle of feet and the whispers of wind through the baobab leaves. It was as if the entire village held its breath. They thought that with the girl gone the terror would fade, that the shadow knife would retreat into the darkness with her. But they were wrong. The curse lingered. It clung to every hut, seeped into the soil, and wound itself around the hearts of those who remained. At first it showed itself in small, unsettling ways. A man bent to draw water from the well and froze when he noticed his reflection rippling differently than his movements. A woman sewing by the fire gasped as her shadow lifted its hand a moment later than her own, as though mocking her. Children cried at night, claiming to hear voices whispering their names from the corners of their huts, voices that sounded like both the girl and something far older. The whispers spread quickly. People began saying the girl had not left at all, that her shadow lingered in the village, watching, listening, waiting. Some claimed they saw it flit across walls when no one stood near. Others swore the knife gleamed in the dust when the sun struck just so, flashing like a reminder of unfinished justice. Mothers warned their children not to wander after dark, not because of wild beasts but because of the shadow that slipped silently between huts, seeking the guilty. The fear poisoned everything. Meals were left half-cooked as women jumped at the flickering of their own fires. Men stopped working in the fields, unable to bear the feeling of being watched by their shadows as they bent over their hoes. Even the animals seemed to sense the unease. Goats bleated at nothing, dogs barked into the night air and then whimpered, tails tucked as if they had seen something their masters could not. The elders tried to calm the village. They gathered the people under the baobab tree, their voices thin with desperation. "It is only your guilt that gives power to fear," one said. "If you walk clean, no shadow will harm you." But even as he spoke, the villagers noticed how his own shadow trembled unnaturally against the ground, and their fear deepened. Faith in their leaders dissolved. The elders, once pillars of wisdom, now looked just as cursed as the rest of them. Huts were abandoned. Families fled into the forest or to neighboring villages, though whispers followed them wherever they went. For those who remained, nights became unbearable. Whispers echoed louder, threading through the stillness like a chorus of unseen voices. Sometimes it was the girl's voice, soft and pained. Other times, it was sharp and cruel, echoing the screams of those who had fallen during the reckoning. More than one villager woke screaming, convinced that a knife had grazed their throat, only to find nothing but air. It became clear, the curse was not tied only to the girl. It had seeped into the fabric of the village itself. The land remembered, the shadows remembered, the air remembered. What had been unleashed was no longer contained within one body, one spirit, or one night. Justice had been carried out, yes, but it had left behind a stain that no prayer or sacrifice could cleanse. The people began to speak of the curse in hushed tones. They said the village was marked forever, that the ancestors had turned their backs, that even the soil rejected forgiveness. Some whispered that the girl's shadow had multiplied, splitting itself to dwell in every hut, in every corner where light met darkness. They said the knife was everywhere now, invisible but sharp, and no one knew when it might strike again. By the time the second moon rose after her return, the village was unrecognizable. The laughter of children had vanished. Fires were burned low at night, for no one wanted to see what danced in the flickering shadows. Conversations were short, clipped, filled with suspicion. Every cough, every scream, every rustle of movement sparked terror. No one trusted their neighbor, for all feared that the shadow followed the guilty most closely, and who among them was truly innocent. It was said that curses did not fall from the sky, nor rise from the earth, but were born from the deeds of people. And here, the villagers began to realize the terrible truth. They themselves had birthed this curse the moment they betrayed her. Her suffering had been the seed, their silence the soil, their cruelty the water that had nurtured it. And now, even if she never returned again, the harvest would continue. The village, once full of life, had become a place where even the bravest dreaded the fall of night. And as the whispers grew louder and the shadows stretched longer, they knew one thing with absolute certainty: what had been done could never be undone. Beneath the weight of the passing years, the tale of the girl without hands transformed into something larger than grief and vengeance. It became a story that was whispered in huts by flickering firelight, a legend mothers passed to their children as they tucked them beneath woven blankets. The villagers called her the Shadow Bride, a name that merged her humanity with the dark, spectral essence that had outlived her suffering. They told of how she had once been beautiful and gentle, wronged by the cruel hands of envy, yet how no cruelty could fully silence her. Where her hands had been taken, her shadow rose to carry the knife of justice. Children grew up hearing that her presence could still be felt on certain nights, when the moonlight stretched across the ground in long shifting silhouettes that seemed alive, or when footsteps echoed though no one was near. To the young, the story was a warning: never take what is not yours, never mock the weak, and never spill the innocent's blood. For the ancestors themselves, it was proof that justice moved in ways unseen, and that no blade, no curse, no exile could undo the power of truth. As the seasons passed, strange happenings etched themselves into the memory of the land. Farmers claimed their shadows sometimes worked ahead of them, cutting furrows in the earth before their hoes touched the soil. Hunters swore they saw a slim, handless figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching with eyes that caught the light of the moon, while her shadow stretched unnaturally long, glinting as though a blade lay within its grasp. Women fetching water late at night spoke of feeling a chill, as if someone brushed past them, and seeing ripples in the river as though another had dipped unseen hands. At first, these were told as fearful omens, reminders of the curse. But slowly people began to regard them differently. They came to believe the Shadow Bride did not linger simply for vengeance but to guard against cruelty taking root again. If her story was heavy with fear, it was also laced with justice, a justice that survived beyond flesh. Elders wove her tale into proverbs. The shadow keeps what the hand cannot, they would say when reminding the youth that deeds cannot be hidden. When disputes arose in the village, people invoked her memory, warning that lies and envy, if left unchecked, would call her shadow to return. Festivals changed too. Drums beat differently when the moon was full, their rhythms a mixture of celebration and caution, acknowledging that the unseen world walked beside the living. Even when travelers came from far-off lands and asked why the villagers hesitated when casting long shadows, they were told of the bride whose shadow lived beyond her death, a bride who had been wronged yet rose with power no blade could cut away. Generations passed, but the story never faded. It took on new shapes with each retelling, sometimes portraying her as a terrifying wraith with a knife of smoke and bone, sometimes as a silent protector whose shadow warned of hidden dangers. Children, wide-eyed and trembling, would ask their elders if she still walked. The answer was always the same: she walks where cruelty hides, and her shadow falls where justice must be remembered. In that way, her suffering became not just a tragedy but a compass, guiding the hearts of those who feared falling into the same cruelty that once devoured her life. The tale of the Shadow Bride became a living memory stitched into the land itself. When the moon rose high and the earth grew quiet, her story breathed again, not merely as fear but as an eternal reminder that cruelty cannot erase justice, and that shadows hold the weight of every wrong that human hands commit. And so, her shadow lives on, dancing against the firelight, etched in the hearts of her people, whispering through the night, "Even in darkness, justice remains."